So today we're going to be continuing our Christmas series, and we've got, instead of one Christmas teaching, you've got 4 Christmas teachings. I know, we kicked it off last week. So this is number 2. And so in this series, we're not just going to be following the story of Mary and Joseph traveling to Bethlehem for the imminent birth, but the whole build-up, which started thousands of years before that. And so the Christmas story as we know it, with the shepherds, the wise men, the angels, the baby in a manger, are actually just the final yards of a journey that began even before the foundations of the earth. Even before God had made anything, when the world was still void and without form. And in the same way that children and adults, let's be honest, anticipate eagerly opening their Christmas presents on Christmas morning, so too were the angels of heaven bursting with excitement for the unveiling of God's gift to this world, which he hidden over millennia and he shrouded in mystery. And as you read through the Old Testament, just like we heard through the mighty oaks, then over time God had revealed the qualities and the nature of this gift to come. But it started with a promise, as we looked at last week, with the fall of man. And so in the book of Genesis, as we looked at last week, right at the beginning of the Bible, we're told of Adam and Eve, who enjoyed a wonderful land to live in. They enjoyed fruitful work, and they enjoyed fellowship with God. And yet, they were deceived by Satan, and they lost it all. And they were thrown out of the land. Their work became a burden to them. They were separated from God, and then death came into the world. And yet, as we looked at last week, despite this tragedy, we get the initial whispers of Christmas and the first seeds of hope. God says to Satan, the deceiver and the enemy of our soul, he says, I will cause hostility between you and the woman and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head and you will strike his heel. And so essentially right here, God is promising the gift. He's promising the gift right here that through whatever had been done through the work of Satan would somehow be undone, and ultimately Satan would be destroyed. This is the seed of hope sown at the very beginning. And like I said, throughout the whole Old Testament, we get glimpses into God's plan and how he planned to execute this. And today we're going to be looking at a prophecy spoken by a man called Isaiah, who existed 3,000 years after this initial promise. So for 3,000 years, this was the promise that they were holding on to, that somehow things would be undone. And today, we get a little bit more of the picture. And so last week we had the promise. This week we've got the prophecy. And so we'll be looking at Isaiah 9, verses 1 to 7. And one of the themes of this passage is of a people walking in darkness. Clayton was reading it. People walking in darkness and coming into light. But before we read that, I want to give some context, because the chapter before, chapter 8, Isaiah chapter 8, really sets the scene and provides the backdrop for everything that we're going to read about in chapter 9, especially, those famous verses in verses 6 and 7. And so if we're going to understand the promise of light, then it helps if we have some definition of what it looks like to walk in darkness. And so basically chapter 8 talks about the northern kingdoms of Israel, who were described as a fearful people. And we dealt with this kind of a lot in our Judges series, so I encourage you to go and check that out online. And in their fear, they didn't seek the Lord, but instead they went after idols. And they sought after the demonic counsel of mediums and necromancers. And then, as a result of their disobedience, they experienced God's judgment. And in their frustration of this, they shake their fists at God, but all of it's of their own making. The reason they're experiencing this is all of their own making. And then verse 22 in chapter 8 says, they will look to the earth, but behold, distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. And then lastly in that chapter, you've also got this threat and warning of impending captivity and removal from the land by the Assyrian army. And so try and remember that, all of that, because it will help later. But essentially, to summarize, those people are walking in darkness, they're living in fear, they're following idols, they're seeking ungodly counsel, they're suffering as a result, and they're facing the threat of permanent judgment and then removal from the land. And this is not just isolated, is it, to the northern kingdoms of Israel, who existed thousands of years ago. It is prophetic to all people, because they're an example to us, aren't they? And it points to all people who, if they are not walking with the Lord, they are walking in darkness with the threat of God's eternal judgment. And so this is why the promised gift of Christmas offers hope to all mankind, because to those walking in darkness, there is a promise of light. And throughout this talk, I've intentionally and purposefully missed out the name and identity of the gift of God, because that's how the people reading this prophecy would have received it. They didn't know who was to come. They didn't know in what way. All they had was types, shadows, and veiled prophecies like this one to indicate who it might be, what he might be like, where he would come from. And so we're largely going to be dealing actually with Old Testament scriptures today. But let me remind you that it's our privilege in the new covenant to know who this gift is. We know who it is. So as we go through, I want you to do the work in your minds to make the connections without me telling you, and I hope that we all see undoubtedly who this is pointing to. And so let's open your Bibles, Isaiah chapter 9, let's read the whole thing. Okay, verse 1. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. That's the northern kingdoms that I was just talking about. But in the latter time he made glorious the way of the sea and the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shone. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you, as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken, as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulder, and he shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Now, when you look at this prophecy, is like a cascade of promises. It's like a chain reaction. And the passage doesn't start from the point of impact and flow outwards. Rather, it starts at the result and then reverse engineers its way back to the source. And then the question that we can ask ourselves as we go through this is simply why. You get this sort of unspoken why, followed by an answer, followed by another why, and then another answer until finally the answer is revealed. And so an example of this might be, like if you were to go to a supermarket right now, you could buy some lovely bananas, ripe bananas from Ecuador for £1. And that's actually revolutionary because bananas, as you may know, don't grow here in the UK. And you'd have to ship a whole bunch, for want of a better word, of them over here. You'd have to ship a whole lot of them to be able to sell them that cheap. And so why is this possible? What is the chain reaction that has happened to make that new reality possible? And so you can trace modern transport networks, which is possible because of production lines, automobile production lines, result of improved health and education systems spanning from labor rights and so on and so on and so on, back until machines were replaced. Man was replaced by machines. That one innovation sparked off a whole domino effect that resulted in a revolutionary transformation that meant you could grab a bunch of bananas to shove in the nappy bag before you came to church this morning. And this, in a way, is how this passage is set up. It's tracing a revolutionary transformation back to its origin. And like I said, it's a cascade of promises. And so my first point is that Christmas, the gift of Christmas, is about a promise of transformation. And so let's look at it. What is this revolutionary transformation that takes place? Verse 1. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. So the first promise that God makes is an end to the gloom of those in anguish. The ending of darkness, distress, and fear. The ending of contempt, dishonor, and humiliation, and instead a time of glory. This is God's goal for his people. This is the transformation that he wants to ignite. He doesn't want them living in a place of fear and gloom. He wants them living, he wants you living in a place of abundance. And remember, we defined what darkness was. He doesn't want people living in fear, following false idols, listening to wicked counsel, suffering because of their sin, and destined for judgment. That is not what he wants. And the human condition is the same now as it was then. And fear will make you do stupid stuff. It will cause you to try and fill that void with anything but God, and that is idolatry. Worshipping money because you fear poverty. Worshipping relationships because you fear being alone. None of those things are wrong, but if you worship them, you become enslaved and bound by these false gods because you've rejected the one true God. One of the biggest pieces of propaganda that we get sold in the media is follow your heart. And the Bible says the heart is deceitful above all things. We saw in Judges, didn't it, that people did what was right in their own eyes. That's, the Old Testament version of follow your heart. Don't follow your heart. Who can truly know the human heart? We follow the Lord because anything else runs the risk of walking in darkness. And so verse 2, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. So the promise of the Christmas gift is a promise of transformation from darkness to light. And specifically, back there in verse 1, the prophecy said that the gift of God will appear from the northern kingdoms, namely the region of Galilee. And though it doesn't mention it here, that gift is coming to the town of Nazareth. And that is significant because Nazareth was not a respected place. It was not held in high esteem. And it was not a place of honor and prestige. And in fact, the question gets asked, can anything good come out of Nazareth? But this gift of God is for everyone, even those in low esteem. The downtrodden, the forgotten, are not excluded from this promise. And notice, it says to those dwelling in darkness, on them light has shone. And so to me, this is saying that those people don't find a way out of darkness, but rather the light is coming to them in their place of darkness. And so the promise of God is not that they will find a light, but rather that light is coming to them. So the promise of Christmas is that light will come to a people who would otherwise never find it. It's like you having the task of driving from here to Cornwall in fog at night with no lights, no map, and no sat-nav. There is no way that you're going to get there. No way. You need someone to pull up in front of you and guide you out. And so, what happens as a result of this light? What happens? Verse 3, you have multiplied the nations. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. Now, remember chapter 8 was warning of impending captivity, that they would be removed from the land. It was a warning of decline and a warning of reduction. But because of this light, there will be multiplication and growth. And this harkens right back to the Garden of Eden, right back to God's initial purpose for man. So Genesis 1, before the fall, Adam and Eve, they are mandated by God to be fruitful and multiply. We are made in the image of God, and therefore we are supposed to spread his likeness throughout the earth. But of course, when we were deceived, sin and death came into the world, meaning that all fruitlessness was forever tainted, and their multiplication would always, always, always end in death. The promise of transformation, therefore, hints at expansion and growth, fruitfulness, as with the harvest, joy and abundance. It's the reverse of everything that was lost in the fall, to restore back to man that which has been lost. It's a promise to man that there is a way out of the fog. There is a way out of the darkness that he finds himself in. For you, stuck in the darkness of addiction, there is a light to guide you out. For those of you stuck in the gloom of depression, there is a light to guide you out. For those of you suffering in the effects of trauma, there is a light to guide you out. So, to summarize that first point, the Christmas gift is a promise to bring transformation. So Isaiah 9 describes a time when light would come to a people walking in darkness and hopelessness. So it's the promise of relief from suffering and the release from the prison of sin to bring forth growth, abundance, and joy. That is the transformation that God's gift is promising. And so now we get to that unspoken why that I talked about. Why is this transformation possible? Well, here we go, verse 4. For the yoke of his burden, the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. So essentially, this transformation is possible because there is freedom. And that's my second point. The Christmas gift is a promise of freedom and peace. And so what are they freed from? Well, in this case, in Isaiah, the people are promised to be freed from the surrounding armies, the captors, and their oppressors. If you were here during our Judges series, then the people you would have seen were instructed to drive out the inhabitants of the land. And this was basically a judgment on those people. It was a judgment of the Lord enacted through Israel on these people. And Israel was supposed to enact this judgment on them, but instead they became influenced and infected by them. And so because of this, God made Israel themselves the subject of his judgment, and they were attacked and they were harassed by the surrounding nations. The surrounding tribes, the neighboring tribes, these became kind of oppressive towards them. And then, if you were here, we got that cycle of judges where they fall into sin, they repent, God delivers them, they're okay for a bit, but then they fall back into sin. This is the cycle that they get stuck in. But more than that, there are three specific things in this verse that highlights what will be removed: the yoke, the staff, and the rod. And so what do these point to? Well, it seems first clear to me that the yoke is pointing to the law. The law was a yoke to Israel. And a yoke, by the way, is a big wooden kind of crosspiece that you connect two oxen together when you're plowing a field. And so for 2,000 years after Eden, God allowed man free reign to live free from the yoke of the law. And this didn't mean that morality didn't exist or there was no eternal law, but rather God was letting man see what he would do if he was left to his own devices. And this basically was a result. The result was that man was bent towards evil. The heart of man does not truly, naturally turn towards God. And then, he speaks to Abraham, and then later you get Moses, and he delivers them the law, the way in which he expected them to live. And this was a heavy yoke for them to bear. God knew that they would never be able to carry the weight of their own righteousness. And he gave them the law so that they would know that too. Sometimes God takes you through stuff so that you know that you can't do it. It's not necessarily for your victory. It's actually to show you that you can't do it. And this was one of the things he was showing them. He wanted to show them that in ignorance that they would be bent towards evil. But even in the full knowledge of God's righteous requirements, they'd still be bent towards evil. The most basic example I could think of this is if you were to walk along the Norfolk coast and smell the smell of fish and chips. Exactly. I live in Cromer, so this is a very common smell for me. It smells so good, you're naturally drawn towards it, and you might go buy some, and then maybe you'll pig out. You get large cod, large chips, jumbo sausage, curry sauce, pineapple fritter, and maybe a Coke to wash it all down. But then, say someone came to you and they told you all the implications of eating like that. It's not good for your health. It's not good for your wallet. They essentially give you a law to live by when it comes to looking after yourself. And so next time you smell that delicious smell wafting up your nostrils, what are you going to do? Are you going to indulge the flesh, or are you going to look after yourself? Are you going to deny it? Now, this is just an example. There's nothing the Bible says you can't enjoy fish and chips. Go and enjoy your fish and chips. Maybe not to that extent. Definitely go and enjoy fish and chips. But when it comes to sin, the Bible says that you are powerless to that seductive smell. You cannot get enough of it, even when you know XYZ is a sin and it's going to hurt you. You're a slave to your flesh. And this is what the law was supposed to reveal to Israel. And here in verse 4, we read that the weight of it, the yoke of it, will be broken. And then the next item we get is the staff. And so I believe this represents governance and leadership. The staff is a symbol of those who care for the flock, isn't it? Those who lead and guide the people. And this too was a burden to Israel. For the most part, they were hindered by bad leaders, self-serving priests, and bad, wicked, evil kings. In fact, when Israel get their first king, King Saul, God warns them of all the pain that this guy is going to bring to them. He says that the king will be self-serving and he'll use you to build his own empire. And if you've read the book of Kings or Chronicles, you often get, XYZ king, he did what was evil in sight of the Lord. And even the good ones, they weren't perfect. Ezekiel 34, it has a prophecy speaking to all the shepherds of Israel, referring to its leaders. It says, shepherds of Israel, who've been feeding yourselves, should not shepherds feed the sheep? And then it talks about all the things that they haven't done for the people. And it says, so they were scattered, the people, because there was no shepherd, and they became food for all the wild beasts. And this is what happened. The people of Israel were exiled. They were scattered from the land and scattered among the nations. The leaders were a burden to Israel. They were by and large evil shepherds. The people needed a good shepherd. And then finally, the rod of their oppressor, which in my mind is Satan. For he is the accuser and the enemy of our soul. In Israel's case, that came through the hand of wicked nations. Ultimately, anyone who is not submitted to the Lord makes himself vulnerable to be used as a tool for Satan. Because the Bible says that Satan has blinded the minds of unbelievers. Much of the things happening in this world is not a result of willful obedience to Satan, it's willful ignorance towards God. And then because of that, they suffer the rod of Satan's schemes. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it was talking about AI. And there's this debate going on at the moment with AI in that industry, whether they're creating a new body for, that has never existed before, a new body, a new being for something that's never existed before, or is AI, in fact, giving a body to something that has long been in existence, i.e. spiritual entities. And this isn't the debate going on among Christians. This is, among secular people. They're trying to figure this out. And so are these people being used as tools in the hands of Satan to make a noose for their own neck? We don't know. But if they're not submitted to the Lord, who knows what, they could be tools in the hand of the enemy. But whatever that is, in all those three things, the yoke, the staff, and the rod are burdens ultimately because of sin. Sin is the thing that unites all three of those things. They couldn't keep the law because of sin. They couldn't lead the people because of sin. And through sin, they were blinded to the works of Satan and suffered oppression as a result. However, those burdens will be broken as on the day of Midian. So what does that mean? Well, the day of Midian, we looked at it in Judges, was when Gideon defeated the Midianite army with only 300 men. He had thousands of men, and God reduced them right down to 300. And they did this without drawing the sword. It said they snuck up on the enemy in the dead of night, and then they shouted at the top of their lungs, they blew trumpets, they smashed clay jars, and then in a state of utter confusion, the Midianites destroyed themselves. They killed themselves. And so what this passage is saying is that these burdens, the burdens that we just looked at, they will be broken in a similar way, unconventionally, unexpectedly, and without drawing the sword. And in confusion, the enemy will bring about his own undoing. And now we get to another why. Why? Why will this happen? Verse 5. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. And so basically, this is saying that these things will happen because there will be peace. And all commentaries that I read, they agreed on this. The weapons of war will be destroyed. That is the main overarching theme of that verse. There will be peace. But I think there's a little bit more to that. So let's just quickly go through it. And this is just my personal opinion, so do with it what you will. So for me, this verse is talking about judgment. Israel, they waged war physically, yes, but these things point to a greater war against sin. And there were two main ways in the Bible that Israel responded to and interacted with God's judgment. The first we've just looked at, they were to enact God's judgment through war and death. Israel were to enact God's judgment on specific, not all nations, these specific nations, he was supposed to enact their judgment by conquering and killing them, by the boots of the tramping warrior. And at times they even had to do this within their own midst. God said, purge the evil from your midst. And this was, through stoning and things like that. The other way to deal with God's judgments was through sacrifice, through the shedding of blood. And priests were instructed to sacrifice animals to atone for their sin. And there's verses in Exodus 29 where the priests are literally told to sprinkle the blood of the animal sacrifice on their garments to make themselves holy. And then another alternative to this could be that in Isaiah 1, Israel's sin is described to them as being like the stains of blood. So in either case, I believe that the garments rolled in blood there has something to do with sin. And then right at the end of that verse, it says that fire will burn up both the boots of war and the garments of blood. Now, fire in the Bible is often a symbol of God's judgment. So for me, this is saying that a judgment will come that will do away with the old forms of judgment and the sin-stained clothes of man. And so to put those two verses together, to put verse 4 and 5 together, we can see that the promise of the Christmas gift is a promise of freedom from the burden of the law you could never keep, freedom from the self-serving government, and freedom from the oppression of Satan, because a greater judgment has come, meaning that the boots of war have been exchanged for shoes of peace. And if you know Ephesians 6, go and read it. If you don't, you'll know what that means. And garments stained in blood will be washed white as snow. And Isaiah 2 tells that physical warriors will be transformed into spiritual farmers. They sow seed instead of shedding blood. It says, they will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And again, why? Why is this possible? And this is when we get to the source. This is the reason for everything that we looked at. And I said at the start, this passage was working its way backwards from effect to cause, from the results back to the point of ignition. And so here it is, the spark that causes that chain reaction. Verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. And this is my final point. The Christmas prophecy points to a promised king. And it says that he will take on the staff of government. He will take on the responsibility of ruling righteously in a way that no man has ever and has proven to never be able to do. Instead, the staff of governance being on our shoulder, as we just looked at, the government will be on his shoulder. The promised gift will be a king of kings, a ruler of rulers, a leader of leaders. All authority will be given to him, and he'll be a wonderful counselor. To those people in Israel seeking and taking the counsel of the wicked from mediums and necromancers, from Satan, the father of lies, to them there will be a wonderful counselor. He will counsel in truth, and he will guide in wisdom. And the same is true for you. If you are sick and tired of the counsel of this world, let me tell you, there is an alternative, and he is wonderful. You know, I'm sure that's why so many young people are flocking into the churches at this moment. For decades, the Western world has lived in prosperity, but this has blinded them and blinded us from the gloom and darkness that we read there in verse 1. It's like all the comfort and shiny objects has distracted people's gaze from the reality of their situation. And yet, many young people are waking up to this because their futures look uncertain, and they see the bankruptcy of the counsel of this world. They are experiencing gloom and anxiety in a way that no other generation has experienced. And to them, a light is being shone. A wonderful counselor is being made known to them. And they are calling him Mighty God with a capital G. The gods of this world are unable to save us from darkness. They are unable to release us from the gloom of our own making. They have proven themselves to be false. Money can never save you from the sting of death. No relationship will ever fully satisfy. Nothing that you set up as a god in this world will ever compare to the wonderful counselor, the mighty God. And by the way, this is the first explicit mention that God's gift for man would be divine in nature. He won't simply be a man as the people had expected. He will be called mighty, capital G, God. And he'll also be called everlasting Father. Like I said at the start, everything man produces, everything that he does will come to nothing. Every building he builds will crumble. Every business he starts will eventually fold. And every one of man's children will grow up to die, just as he will. Everyone in this room, we will all be forgotten in 150 years. You know, how many of you can name even your great-grandparents? But the gift of Christmas, the Christmas gift, brings with it an everlasting Father. And you can't have an everlasting Father without everlasting children. And lastly, they will call him the Prince of Peace. This world offers peace, no doubt. Many of this world's leaders are driven towards world peace, but they will never bring true peace. It will never truly calm the fear. And in fact, this world's brand of peace is actually a wolf in sheep's clothing, because it often brings not peace, but slavery and fear. Only one person can bring the peace that we are truly looking for, and that is the Prince of Peace. And then it says the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. He will initiate the reversal of all that had gone before, instead of decrease and death and scattering that the nations of Israel experienced before. His government promises growth and increase. Fear will be no more, because there will be no end to peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and evermore. So here we're not just promised a king, but also a kingdom, which means a new rulership, new authority, new territory, new inhabitants, new constitution, a new culture, a new economy. And somehow, it's not revealed in this passage, this prince, this king, he will be able to bear the weight of the law and its requirements, because he will rule with justice and righteousness forever. He will satisfy the judgment of God once and for all. And I love the last line. The begrudging obligation and duty of the Lord will do this. It doesn't say that. The zeal of the Lord will do this. So the excitement, the energy, and the enthusiasm of God will make this happen. He wants to give this Christmas gift. When man first sinned back in the Garden of Eden, God wasn't like, oh great, what have they done now? They've ruined my whole plans. What are they doing? He wasn't surprised. He wasn't caught off guard. It was his great master plan from the very beginning, and he's bringing it into fruition with excitement from then. So, in summary, let's put all that together and try and make sense of what this prophecy means concerning this promised gift of Christmas. But instead of going through it 1 to 7, let's go backwards. Let's go 7 to 1 from the point of ignition, and let's go outwards and see what we end up with. So, the zeal, the excitement, the enthusiasm of God will bring forth to you a child, a promised king, and he will be an eternal king, divine in nature, ruling with justice, truth, and righteousness forevermore. And because a promised king is given to you, there will be peace. God's fiery judgment will burn away the old ways. No longer need man wage war upon the wicked. No longer need his clothes be stained in sin. And because there is peace, there will be freedom. The yoke of the law, the burden of evil shepherds, and the oppression of Satan will be broken unexpectedly, unconventionally, and without drawing the sword. And because freedom has come, there will be transformation. The people will grope around in the dark no more, even those in the depths of deep gloom. No longer will they walk as slaves to evil passions, blinded by the counsel of lies. Instead, fear and anguish will be replaced by rejoicing, and their joy will increase. So to their inheritance, and they will be made glorious. Look to the northern kingdoms of Israel, to Galilee, for there the light is coming to you. And so this is what Israel were waiting for with great anticipation. They had the promise spoken to Adam. Now the prophecies. Things were starting to take shape. A king would come, bringing forth peace. Peace would come, bringing forth freedom. Freedom would come, bringing forth transformation. And if you don't yet know the identity of this gift, this king, then you'll have to come for the next 2 Sundays. Next week we've got Thomas, who will be taking us through the preparation. But if you can't wait till then do come and speak to one of us afterwards, because we would love to share him with you. Because the good news is that the gift is here. The gift has come. Freedom is available to you. Transformation is available to you now. If you are stuck in deep darkness and gloom, if you are bound by the weight of sin, these things can be broken today. And there will be people at the side who would love to pray with you.